Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Tonight, we start off with an article on what's going on in the global south related to Bolsonarism and Zionism by Rainer Shea. Zionism, Bolsonarism, and the global south's intensifying genocide. September 2nd, 2001, Rainer Shea. Take it away, Rainer.
2021.
2021.
Yeah, in this article, I talk about how obsessed Bolsonaro is with Israel. He makes the Israeli flag central to his campaign image. His sons have ties to Israel, evidenced by their wearing T-shirts like of Zionism, like they're nerds for Zionism. There's such a strong connection to Israel that Bolsonaro and the rest of the Latin American right have established. They've made it a central partisan issue, and it's clear why, because Bolsonaro and the similar right-wing leaders in that region are essentially engaging in a kind of frontier capitalism, modern version of frontier capitalism, where they're perpetually trying to expand into indigenous territories, mine ever more indigenous resources. They're pushing people out of their homes, destroying indigenous homelands, unleashing death squads, settler death squads. And it's such a parallel to how Zionism's goal is to perpetually expand the territory of God's chosen ones into the indigenous Palestinian territories. And there's also a connection, when you really think about it, to all the major genocidal ideologies of the last several hundred years, from Americanism with its manifest destiny, its belief that the white settlers on this continent have a God-given right to expand into indigenous territories and next these lands, which connects with another major genocidal ideology, Nazism. Nazism was largely inspired by Americanism, by this idea of manifest destiny. Hitler's Lebensraum is seemingly a deliberate attempt to copy America's mentality of having to exterminate these ethnic groups in order to sufficiently grow the territory, the resources of the favored class, the favored nation. And then there's Hindutva fascism, which has been colonizing Kashmir and mass murdering Muslims as part of this colonization campaign. Everywhere it's the same. Everywhere it stems from this basic idea that the favored nation is mandated to grab up as much land as possible for the survival of the Aryans or the Americans or the skewed white Israeli ruling class. Because, you know, in Israel, some Jews are more equal than others. The European Jews are the ones with the most rights, and they actually deport the indigenous Jews over there, which is ironic. And in India, it's the Hindus or the Hindu related ethnicities that get favored. And throughout Latin America, it's the white settlers who are favored. It's so easy to recognize these arguments, these genocidal arguments across these genocidal ideologies, whether it's Nazism or Hindutva fascism or Americanism or Zionism.
Yeah, Hitler commented numerous times, including in his signature work, that the American genocide against 100 million indigenous people was the model for Lebensraum, for his own peculiar form of manifest destiny. So it's a horrendous aspect of the last couple of centuries of European colonial settler effect on the rest of the world. A truly horrendous genocide of monumental proportions, hundreds of millions of people, literally hundreds of millions of people genocided through these kinds of manifest destiny operations. And with God on their side, with God on their side. Yeah. Next on the list, the American Empire's attack on healthcare. Now, this article comes from a article in Consortium News of the attack on healthcare as a human right, September 7th, 2021, not 2001. You were hardly alive back then, were you? Anyway, in in a world divided by Cold War, the Almaty Declaration of 1978 was a triumph for humanity, writes Anis Chowdhury and Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Then came the 1980s. Chowdhury and Sundaram state that instead of a healthcare system striving to provide universal healthcare, a fragmented, profit-driven market non-system has emerged. In the 1980s, neoliberal counter-revolution against the historic Alma Ata Declaration is responsible. Neoliberal health reforms over the last 4 decades have reversed progress made at the World Health Organization Assembly in the capital of the then Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan, now known as Almaty. Then 134 WHO member states reached a historic consensus confirming health as a human right. It recognized that health is determined by environmental, socioeconomic, and political conditions, not only medical factors narrowly understood. The declaration stated, governments have a responsibility for the health of their people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of health, of adequate health and social measures. Also, it went on to say, the people have the right and the duty to participate individually and collectively in the planning and implementation of their health care. Countries committed to fundamental health right, to the fundamental right of every human being to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health care without discrimination. They agreed that primary health care is key to addressing crucial determinants of health. Alma Ata eschewed overly hospital-centric and medicalized systems, instead favoring a more social approach to medicine. In a world divided by the Cold War, the declaration was a triumph for humanity, promising progress for global health. It goes on to talk about, this article goes on to talk about how countries of the West, countries of like the United States, carried out this counter-revolution against healthcare as a human right, using the privatization of public health care, the privatization of other health-related policies and policies like the water system. Water has been privatized. Just about every aspect of healthcare, which was public healthcare in the 1970s, has been turned into privatized systems, where if you've got the money, you get it, and if you don't, you don't. So there's a little bit on the attack on healthcare as a human right. Rainer, what are your thoughts?
That's powerful how you describe this as a counter-revolution against the idea that healthcare is a human right. There's been additional versions of that counter-revolution across the board on economic policies throughout the last 50 years, whether that comes to the New Deal programs that used to provide so many more protections, whether that came to progressive taxation, whether that came to all the other humanistic policies that the welfare states of the 20th century embraced. And this took on two forms. One being the form within the imperialist capitalist countries, and the other being the form it took in the former communist bloc. In the imperialist countries, like the European countries, the United States, Scandinavia, it was a fairly easy policy switch that was suddenly made throughout the 70s, where world leaders pivoted towards neoliberalism, this new system that was just engineered within the brutal dictatorship of Chile. And Margaret Thatcher rationalized it by saying that there was no alternative to this new system of privatization, regressive taxation, austerity, deregulation. Margaret Thatcher, correctly concluded that capitalism at its current stage of crisis could not survive while existing alongside a strong welfare state. Suddenly, wealth had to be perpetually funneled upwards to an extreme extent in order for profits to remain positive. And then they applied this to the former Soviet bloc, what became the former Soviet bloc, through a series of deaths by 1,000 cuts to the Soviet socialist system. And they carried out a coup with the complicity of Mikhail Gorbachev that had been in the works for decades through the influence of revisionist ideas within the Soviet Union. They degraded the state's ability to defend the class struggle. As a result, socialism could not be defended in the Soviet Union. And they applied these policies across both the imperialist countries, across the global south, and across the former Soviet bloc countries. Some of the only countries that still don't have this, even though they've been affected by the neoliberal counter-revolution too, as is inevitable. Some of the only countries that haven't had this shock doctrine applied to them are the 5 remaining communist countries: China, Laos, Vietnam, the DPRK, and Cuba. And that's our only hope, our only way out of this counter-revolutionary dystopia is to carry out proletarian revolutions across the entire world that implement China's system, or the appropriate approximations of China's system, given the local conditions.
Yeah. I would add also Belarus as another country that has got a socialist system that remains a socialist system, that the president of Belarus and the people of Belarus fiercely defend. For instance, last year when we saw the attack by European and American imperialism on Belarus, the people responded in a magnificent way to beat back that imperialist attack. Anyway, that's just an aside. There's still, it's an aspect that we'll have to analyze more to really be sure about, because it's an area of the world that we haven't paid a lot of attention to. But that's the drift that I lean towards. Next, Balkanization, primitive accumulation, and imperialism's collapse. September 6th, 2021 by Rainer Shea.
Throughout this last month, the empire has had its moment of reckoning in Afghanistan. Its occupation government has collapsed within Afghanistan. As a result, U.S. imperialism has suddenly lost access to the $1 trillion worth of minerals that Western capitalists and the Gulf monarchs seek to exploit. That's where that infamous headline, "The Taliban is sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that the world desperately needs," has come from a place that could not be any more cynical. And the US empire is trying to compensate for this profit loss, also the profit loss that's resulted from the collapse of the heroin rat line within Afghanistan, by ramping up primitive accumulation in all the places where the imperialists can still access territories. The imperialists continue to steal Syria's oil. They continue to intensify primitive accumulation within the neo-colonies and the borders of the core imperialist countries, like when they're insisting on implementing these oil pipelines on indigenous lands, like in Minnesota. They're continuing to intensify austerity and privatization and wage cuts and deregulations overall. And they're also doing what I call cutting the empire's losses, which is to say they're trying to destabilize more and more states around the world, even states that are very much neoliberal and for the most part obey the imperialist preferred policies, like the governments of Eritrea and Ethiopia. In Eritrea and Ethiopia, the imperialists have been backing the TPLF, the terrorist group that Washington claims is not a terrorist group. They've been applying sanctions to Ethiopia amid a famine, which is a horrendous atrocity. And they've been getting the TPLF to deliberately exacerbate the famine's impacts by sabotaging essential social services and looting and hoarding food aid that US aid has appropriately given to the TPLF. They're also destabilizing Myanmar. They're trying to continue destabilizing Afghanistan by freezing Afghanistan's wealth and unleashing ISIS, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the new Mujahideen, whatever mercenaries are still in Afghanistan, all the proxies that they can possibly find in Afghanistan, Syria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Myanmar, all these places. They're trying to sabotage the construction of states, sabotage the existing states, so that when the new multipolar world inevitably emerges, Washington hopes China will be left with as few functioning states as possible. Washington's big fear at the moment is that under the Taliban, Afghanistan will undergo China's Belt and Road Initiative projects. We'll see how that goes.
Yes, yeah. It really makes you wonder, where do they think they're going with this? Because this is a process that's leading to the destruction of the world, bit by bit, piece by piece. But it's obviously a last-ditch effort, an effort of extreme desperation by the imperialists to hold on to what they've got, which they see slowly slipping away from them. And part of the process is this Balkanization, this parting nations into smaller and smaller pieces that end up fighting amongst one another and being slim pickings for the imperialists to come in and rule. It's a terrible situation, but it's part of the process we've got to go through to get to where we're going, which is hopefully a world in which all of these imperialist calamities that they visit upon the world are a thing of the past, and in which the future is full of hope and prosperity and a better way of life. Topic number 4, U.S. is waging domestic war and preparing for more. Ajamu Baraka, the Black Agenda Report, editor and columnist, September 8th, 2021 in Black Agenda Report. Now, this is a subject that we've dealt with a lot over the past year or two. The U.S. waging domestic war and preparing for more. But Ajamu pulls it all together in this article, and he pulls into sharp focus the U.S. domestic and international militarism. He says that a new report on the cost of U.S. domestic and international militarism brings the domestic situation into sharp focus. A U.S. ruling elite appears to be preparing for one of three scenarios in the near future: system collapse, a fascist response, or a radical left turn toward a non-capitalist politics. Even beyond the normal counterinsurgency efforts by intelligence agencies against domestic political opposition, with special emphasis on Black opposition by the U.S. states' representative apparatuses, the state has also been moving with great determination to shore up the military capacity of its domestic army, commonly referred to as the police. While many were made aware of new programs of state surveillance and repression of Black political organizations through efforts like the FBI's labeling of certain Black opposition groups with the catch-all term Black identity extremists, and even cases of surveillance and harassment of the more moderate groups like Black Lives Matter, the more insidious efforts of the state repression, such as the establishment of fusion centers, the goal of joint terror task forces, and enormous amounts of military-grade equipment transferred from the federal government to the police forces across the country, escaped critical scrutiny. Part of the reason why this occurred was because over the years, the program's most dramatic increase occurred under the Obama administration. However, a new report by the National Priorities Project entitled State of Insecurity, the Cost of Militarization Since 9/11 revealed the scale and cost of domestic and international militarism. The report estimates that under the guise of war on terror, more than 21 trillion, that's with a T, $21 trillion was spent over the last 20 years. Domestically, it documented how through new agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and its training and funding of federal programs for local police departments, hundreds of billions of dollars were spent over the years. When the Department of Defense's 1033 program is added, the amount goes into the billions. The 1033 program is a program of transferring something like $5 billion worth of Department of Defense weaponry and hardware directly to the police forces in the United States. First noticed by the public when the local authorities in Ferguson, Missouri showed up with armored vehicles, advanced battlefield weapons, and wearing camouflage in response to demonstrations sparked by the murder of Mike Brown. But what the public saw was the result of a process that began decades earlier, again sparked by urban uprisings in militant political opposition organized by the Black Liberation Movement of the 1960s and 70s. These efforts were the genesis of special weapons and tactical teams, SWAT, that were buttressed with an array of federal programs over the years, including the DoD 1033, which transferred some 4.7 billion in surplus military equipment to thousands of police departments. Well, you can see from what I've given you already, this article goes very deeply into exactly how and the kinds of programs used, how they have militarized the police to the point where the police are a veritable domestic army against the people. And the people, that's us, we the people. So I really urge people to read this article. It's in Black Agenda Report for September 8th by Ajamu Baraka, who's bar editor and columnist. Rainer, what are your thoughts?
I'm planning right now to write an article about exactly this, coincidentally, prompted by the recent destabilizing events I've seen with the California fires right where I am, with Hurricane Ida and the subsequent hurricane, with the eviction crisis. There are so many piling up ways in which late stage capitalism is destabilizing this country, and it really is shattering the American illusion that living inside the core of global imperialism somehow makes us here immune to the chaos and misery that so we constantly hear about the rest of the world experiencing. Obviously, there are degrees to this. Obviously, we're not as bad as a place like Ethiopia. Things are not as bad as they are in a place like Ethiopia, where you have all of these people severely malnourished, but malnourishment is present here, mainly in the homeless, especially in the homeless population, seemingly most of all, and a great percentage of even the housed population here. All of these working families, all of these unemployed families are experiencing a growing amount of hunger. Hunger has greatly shot up in these households since the pandemic began. And the more this happens, the worse things get, the more people are going to do exactly what the government fears, which is turn towards radicalism. And it's our responsibility as Marxist-Leninists to continue building our cadres, our organizations, spreading our ideas, so that as much of the population as possible, as much of this disaffected proletariat as possible migrates into the Marxist-Leninist movement and joins the global movement that has successfully created workers' democracies from Asia to Latin America.
Yeah. Number 5 on the list, U.S. destabilizes Eritrea and Ethiopia using Syria-style propaganda, September 8th, 2021, by Rainer Shea.
What I've noticed about these kinds of atrocity propaganda campaigns, whether in Yugoslavia or Syria or Ethiopia and Eritrea, is that they work best when they build off of a grain of existing truth. Isn't that an infamous detail about lies throughout history? That the deceivers function best when they're working off of something that is true, something tangible that people can objectively look at and say, oh, that's true. And in the case of Eritrea and Ethiopia, there are glaring very serious contradictions within the system of governance. These are both very much neoliberal countries where democracy is negligible or non-existent. In the case of Eritrea, maybe you can correct me if I'm exaggerating the contradiction there, but that's from what I understand. And neoliberalism prevails there, and this is exacerbating the worsening conditions within this famine. And the CIA is exploiting this reality, exploiting these conditions to be able to plant all of these fabricated atrocity stories, accusing the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments of deliberately blocking food aid to the Tigray region, of committing all of the most outrageous atrocities imaginable, like concentration camps. I don't know how much of it exactly is true or not, but I know for a fact that quite a lot of it is made up and not consistent with history. And the imperialists are using this to justify the campaign of violence and terror that Washington's proxy army, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, has been carrying out throughout the last year. Last year, the TPLF started invading right at the time when harvest season was happening, so that they could make the famine as bad as possible. And recently, the TPLF was caught looting, stealing, hoarding the food that should have gone to the people. These are really heinous acts, and U.S. aid is complicit for its assistance of these acts. And it parallels the situations in Serbia and Syria, where there were contradictions that have needed to be addressed, but the efforts of the legitimate reformers or the actual revolutionaries have been sabotaged by the US empire's destabilization campaigns. A sad fact about Syria is that the efforts of the genuine, organically emerged reformers were thwarted by the extremist jihadist campaign that the imperialists carried out. And the equivalent is the case in Eritrea and Ethiopia, where all that the imperialist proxy forces intend to do is destabilize the country, make the country as unlivable, as unpleasant as possible.
Wow. Yeah. There's another example of the same thing in a different part of the world, in the Horn of Africa. But same kind of U.S. destabilizing effort, U.S. Balkanization and regime change effort going on there, using the same kind of Syria-style propaganda. Good job there, Rainer. Next on the list, the American Empire's dysfunctional method of war. This comes from an article in the Greenville Post, dated, let's see, when is it dated? September 7th, 2021. And it looks, first of all, at the swift victory of the Taliban and the disintegration of the Afghan government forces, and talks about how this is masking the most significant strategic lessons of the Afghan war, and then generalizing this to other parts of the world as well. Turning points in history usually come by surprise because of the powers that be of the day could see those turning points coming at them. They would take steps to avoid them. Governments and the public alike like to believe that there is more inevitability in history than there really is. Unexpected events of great significance, such as the fall of France in 1940, the overthrow of the Shah of Iran in 1979, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, were followed by inquiries into why experts did not foresee them. These investigations dug down deep in search of root causes of historic change and always find them. But as Lord Northcliffe said, one should never lose one's sense of the superficial. Key ingredients in important historic developments may be decisions and actions occurring that could easily have gone the other way. For instance, there were long-standing reasons for Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait in 1990, but none of those would have mattered if the Iraqi leader changed his mind at the last moment. I argued for a decade that the Afghan government was a floating wreck, that it was its unpopularity and frugality, and not the strength of the Taliban that was driving force in the events. Yet unsatisfactory though the situation was, it could have gone on for a long time had not Donald Trump signaled an extraordinary one-sided U.S. withdrawal agreement with the Taliban in February 2020. And even this might not have produced the final debacle had Joe Biden not decided for domestic political motives to grandstand his speech of 14 April of this year, confirming the American departure before the 9/11 anniversary. He said correctly that the Afghanistan regime provided too rotten a branch for the U.S. to sit on forever, and then decided to jump up and down on the very same branch and not expect it to snap. The details of just how everything fell apart on the night and how this could have been avoided is being vehemently debated, but a far more important lesson is that the American way of war is dysfunctional and automatically generates failure. Claims that the US might have prevented the return of the Taliban if it had not been diverted by the Iraq War or devoted too much time to nation building in Afghanistan should be dismissed as the self-regarding nonsense that it is. Between 2001 and 2021, US administrations invariably acted in their own domestic political interests when it came to Afghanistan. These interests seldom coinciding with those of ordinary Afghans. A curious fact is that the US had won the war by the early months of 2002, at which time the US-backed forces had overthrown the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had left the country for Pakistan. But the White House continued the war on terror, even in the absence of terrorists, because of its strong appeal as a slogan and as a policy to a US public badly bruised by the shock of 9/11. US forces brought back and supported old warlords whose blood-soaked banditry between 1992 and 1996 had given birth to the Taliban by way of reaction. Big and small-time Afghan-style mafioso used American support to win power and money, and often denouncing their rivals as secret Taliban and Al-Qaeda supporters. How this process discredited the anti-Taliban forces and produced the Taliban's return is explained in Anod Gopal's brilliant and detailed book, No Good Men Among the Living, America and the Taliban and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Based on copious interviews, it convincingly describes how the US military intervention first helped to get rid of the Taliban, but then replaced them with predatory local bosses who denounced as terrorists anybody that stood in their way. And he goes on. In this case, he is Patrick Cockburn, who's one of the editors of Patrick Cockburn. This particular article was appeared in the Greenville Post. But he goes on from there to generalize and describe how this same situation is applying in many, many parts of the world today, and how the US over and over again falls back on the same tactics, the same way of doing war, the same dysfunctional way of doing war that it did in Afghanistan.
This is the sequel to this 2004 book, Imperial Hubris, that discusses some of the exact problems you just talked about. One of the first issues that this book covers is the sheer level of opportunism within U.S. intelligence and the military. These officials have, from the start, acted in their political self-interest, and that helped lead to 9/11, and that helped sabotage the U.S. response to the terror. But here's the thing: even if the U.S. had responded with total strategic coherence and competence, the terror would still have gone on because there would still have been blowback to the perpetual atrocities of U.S. imperialism throughout the Islamic world. What this book stresses so much is the reality that these groups, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and so on, you can argue that they're rational actors. They're not acting out of some kind of totally unreasonable, inhuman foolishness. They don't crave mindless destruction. From their perspective, they're responding proportionately to the atrocities of U.S. imperialism, and the waging of unjust war upon the U.S. population during the 9/11 attacks are the cost of this, of the fact that the U.S. is the largest empire in the history of the world and responsible for perhaps more atrocities than any other institution in the history of humanity. This is what happens when you choose to exist as an empire. You get blowback, and we're not going to see an end to global terrorism as it has existed for a long time, until global imperialism is abolished, until the anti-imperialists prevail in all facets of the globe.
Yeah. The Uyghur narrative's goal, proxy destabilization of Afghanistan, September 4th, 2021, Rainer Shea.
We now see the function that the Uyghur narrative has been tasked with serving right from the start. A few years ago, Lawrence Wilkerson, the former Army colonel, described one of the U.S. motives for being in Afghanistan being to use Afghanistan as a launching pad for a proxy destabilization war against the People's Republic of China, facilitated through the stoking of ethnic Uyghur nationalism against the Han Chinese. So they were, from the start, the imperialists have sought to exacerbate these ethnic tensions between the Uyghurs and the Han, vilified the Han as colonial oppressors, and they've been doing this by fabricating all of these atrocity stories about there supposedly being huge concentration camps in Xinjiang, skewing detention statistics, fabricating all of these human rights abuses that these Uyghurs have supposedly suffered. The goal of the imperialists has been to bring about the rise of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the Uyghur ethnic nationalist terrorist group that's been rapidly growing throughout the last year since Trump took it off the terrorist group watch list, and use the ETIM to both destabilize Afghanistan following this current stage of the Afghanistan war where they've pulled out, and the imperialists hope use the ETIM as a launching pad for making this Uyghur ethnic nationalist violence spill over across the border into Xinjiang.
Yeah. And even though the American military has pulled out of Afghanistan, all of that shadow army that I spoke of last week that the U.S. created, the CIA and its various shadow forces, they've all been mobilized now in the northern part of Afghanistan for that very purpose, to carry on that very purpose of ultimately undermining and harming China's rule in the Xinjiang far northwestern district of the country, and also in the Tibetan area, where they hope to sow similar ethnic hatreds. However, so far so good, because so far in Xinjiang and in the Tibet and in the autonomous area east of Tibet, China has full sway and the full backing of the overwhelming majority of the people, because the overwhelming majority of the people are far better off than they were prior to the Chinese full takeover of Tibet in 1951, and prior to the troubles with a small minority of Uyghur terrorists more recently. So anyway, good job all the way around, Rainer. That's the show for tonight, and I'd like to thank you, first of all, Rainer, for bringing what you know and your special expertise to these issues, and thank the viewership and the listenership for tuning in week after week, and invite you to tune in once again next week, when we'll bring you another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.